This is the third PowerPoint in a series called Sias Made Easy. This PowerPoint will be focusing on the SNA1 form. SNA stands for Support Needs Assessment. Inclusion is based on the social model, not the medical model. The medical model used to focus on the child. It used to try and find the problem within the child, and then the child would be labeled as having a deficit. The social model, however, identifies and addresses barriers that prevent a learner from achieving success. Then adaptations are made. Adaptations to the content, the curriculum, or to the method of teaching. This, however, does not mean that we are dumbing down the content or the curriculum. We also focus on the learner's strengths. We focus on barriers to learn. It is very important to notice that we do not focus on the barriers in order to get the learner to pass the grade. Inclusion believes that all students can learn. The only difference is that they do not always learn at the same pace, and nobody learns in the same way. When we start this process, we first of all need to contact the parents or guardians and ask their permission to embark on this process. It is important to note that the parents or guardians form an integral part of this process. Secondly, we need to involve the learner. It is not something that is being done to the learner. The learner needs to understand the process and needs to work the barrier and learn to overcome it. The learner, the educator, and the parent all form an integral part of a learning journey. We need to understand that not all learning barriers can be removed. It must be accepted as part of a child, although not as something negative. It is just something that makes this child different. And after all, we are all unique. Educators, parents, and learners need to cope with it. It is managed, and that is why the ISP is so important, because within the individual support plan, a strategy for managing these barriers are being worked out. Documentation throughout the process is therefore extremely important. The SNA1 starts off with a front cover that asks basic information such as the learner's name and surname, date of birth, and ID number. Please note that the CMIS and the EMIS numbers are two different numbers. The CMIS number is the specific number given to a specific learner by the Department of Basic Education, whereas the EMIS number is a specific number given to each school by the Department of Basic Education. Then we need to fill in the school's name and we need to add the school's contact number. The SNA1 is divided up into three parts. The first part addresses the areas of concern. The second part addresses strengths and needs of a learner. And the third part would be the teacher intervention or support. When we describe our concern about the learner, it is not sufficient to merely mention the learner can't read, because that is not specific enough. A possible answer here would rather be to mention that I have observed that the learner is reluctant to read. When he must read out loud, he becomes emotional. He does not recognize general sight words and do not possess any decoding skills. you can continue to mention all the sounds that the learner is able to recognize. When did you become aware of this and how? Now, the how part can be answered by either I observed the learner or I became aware of this after the baseline assessments, or I read the learner's profile, I read about the challenges and then observed it myself, or I spoke to the previous class teacher and she confirmed it, etc. How is this observation currently affecting the learner? The keywords here are currently affecting. If there are no effects, then we do not mention it. In other words, if a learner has learned to overcome a barrier, or they've learned coping strategies, and therefore it is no longer impacting the learning process, then we will not mention it here. The next part of a form refers to the context of a learner's life. Then we look at strengths and needs of a learner. It is very important to fill in the strengths because in the inclusion process, when we do intervention, we move from what the learner already knows, what he or she can already do, from his strengths to what they cannot do. If we do not mention the strengths, the DBE will question the educator's commitment and own intervention strategies. They want to know that the educator has actually engaged with this problem and that they know the learner. When addressing strengths and needs of learners, the first heading focuses on communication. Here are possible answers. Please note that this is not an exhaustive list and that many more answers can be added. When we look at the strengths of a learner, we can say that the learner is a strong verbal communicator or that he or she knows how to bring a point across. We can also say that they have excellent listening skills. Now we know that certain learners with dyslexia have learned to pay attention in class in order to compensate for the challenges that they experience with taking down notes and reading. We can also say that the learners understand verbal instructions, or that they understand verbal instructions that are not too complicated. Then, under the needs column, we can say that the learner has difficulty following multi-step instructions. And then under support needed, we can say that in order to accommodate the learner that presents challenges or experience challenges with understanding complex verbal instructions, we will be breaking down these instructions. Under strengths, we can also say that the learner has a well-developed nonverbal communication. In other words, the learner might not be able to communicate well verbally, but they've learned to use their body language or sign language in order to express themselves. We can say that the learner communicates clearly, which means that there will be no speech impediments such as lisping or stuttering. We can say that the learner is a confident communicator or that they're emotionally intelligent. In other words, they pick up easily on nonverbal cues. We can also say that they frame appropriate questions clearly. In other words, if they get stuck, they can ask for help. Now, how do we assist learners with communication barriers? Well, if there's a speech impediment, we can refer the learner to a speech therapist. Or if they experience challenges in written communication, we can teach them to use a dictionary, especially if they have specific challenges with regards to spelling. We can also provide individual support where we talk to the learner or communicate with the learner one-on-one. Or we can employ a buddy system wherein a friend can assist this learner and sometimes just read instructions or maybe help and translate instructions, especially when the learner is struggling with communication due to the fact that the language of learning and teaching is not the child's home language. Then we can assist the learner in preparing orals. We need to be sensitive though, because if a learner has a speech impediment, we will not expect that learner to present his or her oral in front of the class. But this learner may be allowed to come and present his or her oral at the teacher's desk, or even come in during break to present the oral. We can also apply for concessions, but applying for concessions is quite complicated and there's a certain process to follow. And therefore, this whole aspect of applying for concessions will be addressed in another PowerPoint. We can also make use of auditory cues. In other words, if we want to help the learner or remind the learner that they should continue reading or continue focusing, we can arrange with the learner that whenever we clap our hands, that is to serve as a reminder. When there's difficulty in writing or written communication, we can help the learner with the correct pencil grip, and we can even give a learner exercises that they can do at home in order to develop fine motor skills. The next aspect under the strengths and needs of a learner is behavior and social competence. This refers to the learner's ability to interact and work with other learners, as well as to follow classroom routines. Here are some possible answers. Once again, these are not the only answers. It's not an exhaustive list, but many more can be added. When we refer to the learner's strengths, we might say that the learner is neat and self-disciplined, or that they've got good discipline, or that their discipline has improved, or that they obey the class rules, they've got good social skills, they're respectful towards peers, they're considerate towards friends, they're good in one-on-one relationships, they're emotionally mature, they cooperate in class, they participate in group discussions, they're helpful in class, they've got a good value system, good time management, they're well organized, they've got a positive self-identity, or they're able to play with others most of the time. The needs or the at-risk factors might be that they have challenges with authority or class rules, or they are bullying, or they swear, or they've got poor social skills, etc. They can also be procrastinating, or be disruptive in class, or be withdrawn, overly emotional, or they do not realize how their actions affect others. Now, how can we support these learners? One, we can refer them to the SPST, or ask that that learner be observed by the learning support teacher. We can keep a behavioral record or journal, or we can ask the learner to keep an emotional journal, because they don't always realize how emotional they are. They don't always realize what the triggers are. So they can keep a journal saying that today I became angry. Why did I become angry? When did I become angry? And we might be able to discern a pattern and realize that the anger mostly happens at the beginning of a day. So that could mean that the child is still trying to adjust, or it can happen at the end of the day because the child is tired. I've also found that child on medications such as Ritalin become more agitated once the Ritalin starts wearing off. We can also develop a behavior support plan, but this should happen with the learner's input, as it is once again not something that should happen to the learner, but the learner should be able to take responsibility for his or her own behavior. Then all role players should work together. We cannot develop a behavior support plan when there are different rules at home and at school. Then a discussion with the parents and the guardians so that we can have a support of the parents, especially when it comes to something like an anti-bullying program. The learner can attend an anti-bullying program as well. And here we can incorporate NGOs or community programs. The learner must also be clear on the class rules, and there must be clear and consistent consequences. We also need to set routines in place, give responsibilities to the learner in class, and have one-on-one conversation with this learner, establish clear social cues, and we can even go as far as visually marking the space around the ruler, making use a space around the learner, making use of a ruler or a rope. And this especially would be necessary for learners who do not understand that they're constantly in others' space. We can also compile a behavior contract. The next aspect is health, wellness, and personal care. The learner's physical appearance, do they look healthy, clean, well-fed, and their emotional well-being and health status is reported on under this heading. Once again, here are possible answers. Under strengths, we can say that the child is healthy. A very important aspect to mention, if it is relevant, is that the child is rarely absent, that they've got healthy eating habits, in other words, they don't live on sweets and treats, or that they participate in sport, that they have a neat appearance, that they're always clean and well presented. Even though their clothes might be old, they still look neat and tidy. They've got good personal hygiene. In other words, after break, they don't come walking in looking like they've been rolling around in the dust. Their hands are washed, their nails are clean, etc. They're emotionally well adjusted. In other words, they're not overly emotional, throwing tantrums or screaming, shouting, crying for no reason or no apparent reason. Their socioeconomic circumstances might be poor, yet their parents might be very caring. Their parents or guardians are involved, or there's no sensory impairments. In other words, they're healthy. Now, what can be the risk factors? We need to mention chronic diseases such as asthma, diabetes, epilepsy, depression, etc. Sensory impairments, such as the fact that they need to wear glasses or hearing aids. We need to mention allergies, unhealthy eating habits. We need to mention if they are OCD, ADD, ADHD, whether they have autism. If they appear neglected, dirty, or there's poor hygiene. If there's a possibility of abuse or bruises, of course, when we see any possibility of abuse, it has to be reported and the teacher has to fill in a Form 22. If they're regularly absent, it can eventually also be a sign of neglect, which must be reported. It can also be reported to safe schools. If there's addiction, this also must be reported, making use of a Form 22. If there's no parent involvement, if there's poor socioeconomic circumstances, or if the child is constantly hungry. How can we support them? First of all, I mentioned that when there's a possibility of neglect or abuse, that must be reported according to law. If there's allergies, we must make sure that the asthma pump is at school, that there's an anti-serum for bee sting, etc. If a learner wears glasses or hearing aids, we must make sure that they do so in class. We need to be in constant discussion with the parents or guardians. If we suspect ADD or ADHD, we can complete a SNAP form and ask the parents to do the same. This form asks questions such as, does the child have difficulty sitting still? Do they constantly walk around? Do they have difficulties focusing in class, etc.? This form can be asked from the learning support teacher. And then once again, if there's abuse or neglect, I have to emphasize that a Form 22 must be handed in at the principal or the LST. In conclusion, when talking about the strengths and needs of a learner, which is the second aspect of the SNA1, you can look at the example that has been given to you. In this example, all the possible answers that has been discussed within this PowerPoint or that has not been covered in this PowerPoint can be found. The third aspect of the SNA1 is the teacher interventions or support. Now, the first intervention will focus on curriculum. What curriculum interventions have you as teacher implemented to address your concerns? Comment on or explain how the curriculum content has been differentiated. That is, taking into account that every learner should have access to the grade level teaching and assessment best suited to his or her needs. Have a learner's needs been met by a differentiated curriculum? And have a learner's abilities determined what is expected of him or her without discrimination? The first curriculum intervention focuses on content. Now, when we intervene with regards to curriculum content, we first of all need to plan intentionally in order to take the individual learners into consideration, as well as their learning style, as well as their type of intelligence. We also need to assess the learner's prior skills and knowledge. And then we can make use of scaffolding, the buddy system, cooperative learning, varied teaching materials is very important. We need to accommodate all intelligences. In other words, we need to make use of visual materials. We need to make use of auditory materials. We need to allow the learners to be actively involved to accommodate the learners that are kinetically intelligent. We need to take the learners' needs, their learning styles, and their interests into consideration. It does not help to make use of examples referring to European countries, whilst the learner do not know what's going on in those countries. We need to make use of examples that the learner can relate to. Should be a learner-centered approach. We should adjust the curriculum content so that it fits with the learner's frame of reference. There should be differentiation within assignments. There should be a variety of teaching methods and strategies. There should be weekly reflection, individual assistance. We should adjust the pace, break assignments up into smaller doable parts, adjust the volume. In other words, how much do we add? We need to understand, though, that there are learners that need the enrichment or they will get bored in the classroom. And if they're bored, that might lead to disciplinary challenges. We need to constantly motivate our learners. We need to allow some choice. In other words, the learners need to be able to take ownership of their learning. We should explain instructions in more than one way and give examples. And we should make use, once again, as I said, of teaching aids. We need to make the content more accessible, not easier. The second intervention would be the teaching methods. We can make use of guided practice, demonstrations, modeling, once again the buddy system, once again cooperative learning, group work, scaffolding, differentiated assignments, group work, and collective class activities. These are just a few. You may add as many as you like. Do not, however, within all these intervention strategies, make the learner feel isolated. When we apply the teaching methods, it is nice to be able to apply these methods within a class setup and not single out the learner that needs the intervention every single time. Curriculum intervention with regards to assessment. We want to know what the learner has learned. Therefore, we make the assessment more accessible, not easier. We are not dumbing down the assessment. Now we can do that. We can make the assessment more accessible by breaking it up into more manageable parts. Or we can give examples, or make use of pictures for the visually inclined learner, or individual attention. We can read a question to a learner, or if we see a learner that's struggling to keep focusing, we see their attention wandering off, we can motivate them continuously to keep going. We can also apply for assessment accommodations. We however need to know that this is a formal process with set guidelines. Therefore, applying for assessment accommodations will be addressed within another PowerPoint. When we talk about teacher interventions or support, I have given an example as well, where all the possible answers that has been mentioned within this PowerPoint can be seen, as well as those that were not addressed within this PowerPoint. Another question that should be answered within the SNA1 is, what additional support do you require from the school-based support team? Well, the SBST can refer the learner to the learning support teacher, who will then scholastically test the learner. The learner can also be referred to the psychologist or the social worker that's stationed at the district offices, or Badisa, who's the community social workers, Tiger Bear, who assists with emotionally traumatized learners. The learner can be referred to the clinic for eye testing, to the speech therapist for further testing at the district offices. The learner can be referred to a special school. But we need to understand that this is a long process and that the learner first needs to be referred to the district-based support team before the next step. Especially as well with School of Skills. Once again, this is a long process, and first of all, the learner needs to be referred to the DBST. And none of this can happen without the parent's consent. We can ask assistance with parent intervention or learning support by the learning support teacher, learner observation by the learning support teacher. The learning support teacher will then come into the classroom and just observe a learner within the classroom setup and then write a report. Disciplinary intervention, assistance with the individual support plan or group support plan if there's more than one learner who needs the same support, assistance with intervention strategies, assistance with assessment adjustments, adjustment of school policies if there's a policy that eventually leads to a learner being neglected or a learner that cannot be accommodated. These policies must be adjusted. The training of educators, especially in the case of autism or dyslexia, and the drawing in of resources such as non-profit organizations, which, for instance, can present anti-bullying programs. The SNA1 is a working document. We can therefore not complete the SNA1 and have a parent sign it in grade 1. And then when we get to grade 5, refer the learner to the SBST in order to have a learner referred to the DBST, district-based support team, in order to have a learner referred to a special school. Each year, the SNA1 should be adapted and added to. This is, however, difficult as there's no space to do so. Therefore, I have added an addendum. You will see that it's only 2 pages long, and it allows the educator to add to the already existing document. And it also allows the parents to once again sign because of the journey that's taking place. The learner will evolve. The education process will evolve. And therefore, the parent cannot just sign in grade 1 because the information changes as the learner develops. Thank you for your time.